here's what makes this battle absolutely mesmerizing. A Persian king with no navy defeats a maritime empire. A nomadic warrior outsmarts the wealthiest man alive. And the entire conquest hinges on one brilliant, audacious move involving camels, yes, camels, that changed the course of Western civilization forever. This isn't just another ancient war story. This is the moment when raw military genius proved that all the gold in the world couldn't buy victory. And by the end, you'll understand why modern military academies still study this campaign 2,500 years later. But here's the twist that nobody sees coming. The real genius wasn't in the battle itself. It was in the psychological warfare that happened before a single sword was drawn. The Lydian capital of Sardis gleamed like a jewel embedded in the Anatolian highlands in 547 BCE. Its citadel walls caught the morning sun and threw it back, as if the city itself were forged from precious metal. And in a sense, it was. Lydia had invented coined money. Every marketplace from the Aegean to Mesopotamia rang with Lydian gold statters, stamped with the roaring lion and bull. The kingdom's wealth wasn't legendary, it was mathematical, tangible, counted in talents and drachmas that filled treasury rooms deep beneath the royal palace. King Croesus walked those treasury corridors often, running his fingers through piles of coins that represented more wealth than most kingdoms would see in a century. His servants whispered that he sometimes fell asleep down there, surrounded by gold, as if proximity to wealth could protect him from the dangers gathering in the east. But Croesus wasn't a fool, despite what Persian propaganda would later claim. He was a careful, calculating ruler who had spent 20 years expanding his kingdom, absorbing Greek city-states along the Ionian coast, building alliances, consulting oracles before every major decision. He understood that wealth was power, the power to hire mercenaries, to bribe enemies, to outfit armies that lesser kingdoms couldn't match. His court was a showcase of that power. Egyptian architects designed his palaces, Phoenician engineers built his fortifications, Greek poets composed verses celebrating his generosity, Babylonian astronomers charted the stars for him. It was a concentration of talent and resources that seemed invincible, a gravitational center of civilization itself. Gold flowed into Sardis from mines in the surrounding mountains, from trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Silk Roads of the East, from tribute paid by vassal states. The treasury grew year after year, a physical manifestation of security, or so Croesus believed. In 547 BCE, troubling reports began arriving from the east. A new power was rising in Persia, consolidating territory at a breathtaking pace. Cyrus, they called him Cyrus the Great already, though he was barely 50, had overthrown his Median overlords, absorbed their empire, and now was turning his attention westward. The intelligence Croesus received painted a picture of a different kind of king. A man who traveled with his troops, who personally scouted terrain, who seemed to care more about loyalty than luxury. Merchants described a leader who could recite the names of common soldiers, who ate the same rations as his men, who had risen to power not through inheritance, but through a combination of military brilliance and political cunning. It was the kind of profile that should have worried Croesus more than it did. But when you're the richest man in the world, when you've never faced a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient gold, it's hard to imagine that this time might be different. Croesus looked at his overflowing treasuries and saw the solution to any threat. Need more soldiers? Buy them. Need better weapons? Commission them. Need allies? Purchase their loyalty. It was a worldview built on decades of success, reinforced by every previous challenge he had overcome through the application of wealth. Still, Croesus was cautious enough to seek divine guidance. He sent envoys to Delphi, to the oracle of Apollo, asking whether he should attack Persia preemptively. The priestess, breathing the sacred vapors, gave her famous response: "If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire." Croesus heard what he wanted to hear. He also consulted the oracle of Ammon in Egypt, which gave similar encouragement. He sent gifts to both temples, magnificent gifts, golden statues and precious offerings, as if divine favor could be purchased like mercenary services. What he failed to consider was the beautiful, terrible ambiguity of prophecy. Which empire would be destroyed? The question should have haunted him. It didn't. Cyrus, meanwhile, was conducting a different kind of preparation. While Croesus counted his gold and consulted his oracles, the Persian king was studying maps, interrogating merchants about road conditions, questioning captured soldiers about Lydian military doctrine. Where could armies find water in the Anatolian summer? Which passes through the mountains could accommodate baggage trains? What were the seasonal patterns of the Halys River, that great boundary between Lydia and the growing Persian territories? What crops grew in different regions and when were they harvested? What were the traditional rhythms of Lydian military campaigns? Cyrus grew up in the harsh highlands of Persia, where survival depended on reading landscapes, understanding weather, knowing how to move large groups of people across difficult terrain with minimal resources. These weren't skills you could buy. They had to be learned through necessity, refined through experience, passed down through generations of people who lived close to the edge of survival. The Persian aristocracy were warrior shepherds, men who could track animals across mountains, who understood migration patterns, who knew how to find water sources that weren't obvious, who could predict weather by reading clouds and wind. This knowledge base gave Cyrus something that all of Croesus's gold couldn't purchase, a fundamental understanding of logistics that went deeper than hiring experts. Cyrus didn't just employ people who knew things, he knew them himself. He could look at terrain and understand what was possible, what was difficult, what was supposedly impossible but might actually be achievable under the right circumstances. This intimate knowledge would prove decisive. The Persian army that began moving west in 547 BCE looked nothing like Croesus's cosmopolitan force. These were tribal warriors, Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Scythian auxiliaries, unified not by money, but by a combination of fear, respect, and genuine belief in their king. Cyrus had a gift for leadership that transcended material rewards. He ate the same rations as his men. He knew many of them by name. He had fought alongside them, shared their dangers, mourned their dead. When the army marched, Cyrus rode at various positions in the column, sometimes at the front, sometimes in the middle, occasionally at the rear, always visible, always present. It created a bond that gold couldn't forge, a loyalty that couldn't be purchased. But more than loyalty, Cyrus cultivated something else in his army: adaptability. Persian military training emphasized problem-solving over rigid doctrine. Soldiers were encouraged to think, to adapt, to find solutions rather than simply follow orders. It was a military culture that valued cleverness as much as courage, that rewarded innovation rather than punishing deviation from standard procedures. This would matter enormously in the campaign ahead. The two armies met first in Cappadocia, in the broad plains east of the Halys River. Croesus indeed crossed that fateful boundary, marching confidently into what he assumed would be a decisive campaign. His army was magnificent to behold: Lydian heavy cavalry in bronze armor, Greek hoplite mercenaries in perfect phalanx formation, auxiliary troops from a dozen different nations, siege equipment, supply trains that stretched for miles. It was a military force that represented the accumulated martial wisdom of the entire civilized world, purchased and assembled with Lydian gold. The battle that followed was vicious and inconclusive. Lydian cavalry crashed into Persian lines like a bronze wave. Greek phalanxes ground forward against Iranian infantry. The fighting lasted an entire day, from dawn until darkness made further combat impossible. Both armies fought with desperate courage. Both suffered terrible casualties. The field was covered with the dead and dying from both sides, men crying out in a dozen different languages, horses screaming. The smell of blood and excrement and fear hung heavy in the autumn air. When both armies finally disengaged as darkness fell, neither king could claim victory. It was a stalemate, the kind of bloody draw that often ended campaigns in the ancient world. Both forces had been badly hurt. Both needed time to recover, to treat wounds, to reorganize shattered units.
Here's where Croesus made his crucial mistake, one that seems almost incomprehensible until you understand the psychology of a man who had never truly faced limitation. Winter was approaching. The campaigning season was effectively over. In the ancient world, armies typically disbanded during winter months. Soldiers returned to their farms and families. Professional warfare was a seasonal activity, constrained by weather and agriculture and the simple fact that moving large bodies of men across difficult terrain in winter was considered impossible. Croesus, standing on that blood-soaked field, calculated that he had time. He would withdraw to Sardis, the impregnable fortress capital. He would send messages to his allies, Egypt, Babylon, Sparta, requesting support for a spring campaign. With combined forces, with months to prepare, with the full weight of the civilized world behind him, he would crush this Persian upstart decisively. It was a perfectly reasonable strategy by all conventional military wisdom of the era. He dismissed his Greek mercenaries, paying them their wages and sending them home for the winter. He released his auxiliary troops. He kept only his core Lydian forces, pulling them back to Sardis and the surrounding territory. Then he settled in to wait for spring, confident that the campaign was suspended until the seasons changed. Except Cyrus wasn't conventional, and this is where the story becomes absolutely riveting. The Persian king watched the Lydian army withdraw and made a decision that would echo through military history for the next 2,500 years. He wouldn't wait for spring. He wouldn't give Croesus time to gather reinforcements. He wouldn't play by the rules that everyone else followed. Winter campaigning was considered impossible, which meant it was exactly what Cyrus would do. Think about what this decision meant. Winter in Anatolia could be brutal. Snow in the mountains, freezing rain in the valleys, roads turning to mud, rivers swelling with runoff. Supply lines would be nearly impossible to maintain. Soldiers would suffer from exposure. The normal sources of food, foraging, requisitioning from local populations, would be far less available. Every military manual, every strategic tradition, every experienced commander would have said this was madness. Cyrus said it was opportunity. While Croesus sent his Greek mercenaries home for the season and dismissed his auxiliary troops, assuming he had months to prepare, the Persian army kept moving west, not retreating, not establishing winter quarters, advancing through mountains that should have been impassable, maintaining a pace that should have been unsustainable, moving toward Sardis with grim determination. Now imagine being a scout in Croesus's service, returning to Sardis with impossible news. The Persians weren't retreating, they weren't establishing winter quarters, they were coming, in winter when no one fought wars. Croesus must have thought his scouts were mistaken or exaggerating or lying, but report after report confirmed it. Cyrus was bringing the full Persian army straight toward Sardis in conditions that should have made military operations impossible. And here's what makes this maneuver so brilliant. Cyrus wasn't just moving fast, he was destroying Croesus's entire strategic framework. Every calculation the Lydian king had made was based on having months to prepare. Every diplomatic message he had sent to potential allies assumed a spring campaign. Every defensive preparation was predicated on having time. Cyrus wasn't just attacking Sardis, he was attacking time itself, compressing the campaign into a window that conventional wisdom said didn't exist. The Lydian king faced a crisis. Most of his mercenaries were gone, scattered to their homes across the Greek world. His auxiliaries were dismissed. He had to quickly assemble whatever forces he could from Sardis itself and the immediately surrounding territory. What he managed to gather was still formidable. His core Lydian cavalry, thousands of the finest mounted warriors in the world, some local infantry, his personal guard, militias raised from the city. It wasn't the grand army he had commanded in Cappadocia, but it was substantial. And he had one tremendous advantage. Cavalry was Lydia's specialty, and the broad plains before Sardis were perfect cavalry country. Croesus deployed his horsemen in massive formation, planning to use their superior mobility and striking power to shatter the Persian forces before they could properly deploy. It was sound tactics. Cavalry against infantry on open ground should favor the cavalry. The Lydian heavy cavalry were renowned throughout the ancient world. Bronze-armored riders on powerful horses, wielding long spears, trained from childhood in mounted warfare. They had broken armies before. They would break this one. Croesus looked at the Lydian cavalry and saw a problem that couldn't be solved by conventional tactics. His infantry would be cut to pieces by a mounted charge. His own cavalry was outnumbered and outclassed. Everything about the tactical situation favored Croesus. Every military manual, every tactical doctrine, every historical precedent suggested that the Persians were about to be destroyed. Which is why Cyrus stopped thinking tactically and started thinking biologically. Horses hate the smell of camels. It's not a mild aversion, it's a visceral, instinctive panic reaction. Horses have evolved alongside certain predators, developed instincts about what's dangerous and what's safe. Camels are wrong in every way. Wrong shape, wrong scent, wrong movement, wrong sounds. A horse encountering a camel's smell for the first time will often refuse to advance, will back away, will sometimes bolt entirely, no matter how well trained it is. This reaction is hardwired, deeper than training, impossible to overcome through discipline or courage. Croesus knew this. He had grown up in a part of the world where camels and horses coexisted, where merchants and herders understood the relationship between these animals. He had seen it himself, probably dozens of times, horses panicking at the approach of camel caravans, riders struggling to maintain control, the sheer biological incompatibility between these two species. The Persians had camels. Every long-distance military force in that era used them for carrying supplies, especially water and heavy equipment. They were pack animals, background elements of the baggage train, not combat units. No one fought wars with camels. They were too slow, too awkward, too obviously unsuited for battle, which is exactly why Cyrus decided to fight this battle with camels. He gave orders that must have seemed insane to his commanders. Take the camels from the baggage train, every single one. Put men on them, not soldiers particularly, anyone who could sit on a camel without falling off. Camp followers, grooms, servants, anyone. Form them into a unit and place them at the front of the army. Behind the camels, position the infantry. Behind the infantry, hold the cavalry in reserve. It was a formation that violated every principle of military doctrine. Baggage animals at the front, the weakest, most vulnerable elements of the army in the position of greatest danger, combat troops in supporting positions. It made no tactical sense whatsoever. Until the Lydian charge began. Picture the scene from a Lydian cavalry officer's perspective. You're mounted on a magnificent war horse, an animal that cost more than most men earn in a lifetime, trained for years, responsive to every command. You've drilled with this horse hundreds of times. You know its movements as well as your own. Around you are hundreds of fellow cavalrymen, your kingdom's pride, the force that has made Lydia feared across the ancient world. You're armored in bronze, holding a spear, part of a formation that has broken enemy armies like waves breaking against cliffs. Before you, across the plain, you can see the Persian army in their bizarre formation, some kind of mounted unit at the front, but the riders look awkward, uncertain, easy targets. Your commanders give the signal. This is what you've trained for. This is what Lydian cavalry does. They charge, they strike, they shatter enemy formations, they turn battles into routs. You lower your spear, you press your knees into your horse's legs, you begin the charge. The thunder of hooves, the shouted battle cries, the distance closing. You can see the Persian line ahead, can imagine the impact, the breaking of their formation, the beginning of victory. Your horse is galloping now, powerful, responsive, carrying you towards the enemy. And then your horse smells the camels.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The animal beneath you, your partner, your weapon, your mobility, your advantage, suddenly wants nothing to do with the battle. It's trying to turn, it's backing up, it's tossing its head, fighting the reins, ignoring your commands. You can feel the panic in the creature's muscles, can sense that no amount of training is going to overcome this biological terror. Around you, you hear confusion, anger, commands that can't be followed because the horses simply will not advance. Some riders are throwing as their mounts rear or spin. Others are trying desperately to maintain control. The formation that was supposed to crash into the Persian line like a bronze wave is instead fragmenting, swirling, collapsing into chaos. And the Persians haven't struck a single blow. They're just standing there, behind their line of camels, watching the most feared cavalry force in the ancient world destroy itself. The Lydian cavalry, the force that Croesus had counted on to win the battle, was neutralized without the Persians lifting a weapon. It's one of the most brilliant tactical innovations in military history, not because it was complex, but because it was so simple, so unexpected, so perfectly exploited a weakness that no one had thought to defend against. Croesus himself reportedly dismounted and tried to rally his troops on foot. There's something both admirable and tragic about that image. The richest king in the world standing in the dust, watching his primary advantage evaporate because of pack animals. He had spent a fortune on his cavalry. He had trained them, equipped them, prepared them for every conventional threat. But he hadn't prepared them for this, because this wasn't in any manual, wasn't part of any tactical doctrine, wasn't something anyone had done before. The battle that followed wasn't the dramatic cavalry action Croesus had planned. It became a grinding infantry engagement. And in that kind of fight, the Persians had numbers, momentum, and the psychological advantage of having just watched their enemy self-destruct. By day's end, the Lydian army was broken. Survivors fled back to Sardis. Croesus barely made it inside the city walls. Now came the siege, and this is where we see the second phase of Cyrus's strategic brilliance, the part that proves this wasn't just about one clever trick, but about a completely different approach to warfare. Sardis was considered impregnable. Its citadel stood on a steep-sided mountain spur, with sheer cliffs on most approaches and massive walls guarding the few accessible routes. The fortifications had been designed by the best military engineers gold could buy. The walls were thick enough to resist siege equipment, high enough to deter scaling attempts. The city had cisterns and storehouses capable of sustaining a siege for months, perhaps even a year or more. Defensive positions commanded every approach. It was the kind of fortress that ended campaigns, that forced attackers to settle in for lengthy blockades, or simply give up. Croesus still held hope that his allies would arrive with reinforcements. He had sent desperate messages to Egypt, to Babylon, to Sparta, calling in every favor, offering every inducement. If he could hold out for a few months, if the Persian army had to endure a winter siege in hostile territory, if supplies ran low and disease spread through the Persian camp, there were still ways this could turn around. Sardis had never fallen to assault. The conventional move for Cyrus would have been to settle in for a months-long blockade, to try to starve the city out, to wait for diplomatic solutions or for Croesus's allies to negotiate terms. Cyrus gave his army 14 days to take Sardis. It was another impossible deadline, another rejection of conventional wisdom. 14 days to take a fortress that had never been successfully stormed in its entire history. 14 days to accomplish what should take months or years. 14 days or failure. But Cyrus understood something profound about psychology and motivation. A deadline creates urgency. It forces creativity. It tells your soldiers that you expect results, not excuses. It prevents the kind of comfortable, lazy siege mentality where armies settle into routine and stop looking for opportunities. The Persian army surrounded Sardis and began probing the defenses systematically, testing every section of wall, examining every approach, looking for weaknesses. They tried scaling ladders, repulsed. They attempted to undermine sections of wall, detected and countered. They made feint attacks to probe the defenders' responses. Nothing useful learned. Day after day, they searched for a way in, and day after day, the fortress held. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a single Persian soldier named Herodes. He was positioned watching one section of the citadel walls, probably bored, certainly not expecting to be the key to the city's fall. It was tedious duty, watching walls that everyone agreed were unscalable, waiting for nothing to happen. But Herodes was paying attention, and on what must have been the 10th or 11th day of the siege, he saw something that countless people had probably seen before but never registered as significant. A Lydian defender on the wall dropped his helmet. It tumbled down the cliff face. The man disappeared from view. A few minutes later, he reappeared, helmet in hand, having climbed down and back up to retrieve it, which meant there was a path. Think about what this observation required. First, Herodes had to be watching carefully enough to notice. Second, he had to understand the significance that a man climbing down and back up meant the cliff wasn't as impossible as it looked. Third, he had the courage to report it, and then the courage to actually attempt the climb. Most soldiers would have missed it, or seen it but not understood, or understood but not acted. Herodes did all three. He reported what he'd seen to his commanders. They brought it to Cyrus. The Persian king looked at the section of wall, calculated the risk, and made his decision. That night, Herodes would lead a small group of soldiers up that route. It was a desperate gamble. If they were discovered, they'd be killed. If the route proved more difficult than it appeared, they'd fall to their deaths. If they reached the top but found that section of wall fully defended, they'd accomplish nothing except their own deaths. But if they made it, if they could hold a position long enough for more troops to follow, if they could open a gate from inside, then 14 days would be enough. That night was probably the longest of Herodes' life, climbing in darkness, trying to stay silent, knowing that a single misplaced grip would mean a fatal fall, or worse, an outcry that would alert the defenders. The cliff face that looked possible in daylight must have felt impossible in the dark, every handhold uncertain, every foothold precarious, the distance seeming to stretch infinitely. Behind him, other Persian soldiers following his guidance, trusting his judgment, their lives depending on his judgment. But they made it. They reached the top of the wall in a section that was undermanned precisely because the Lydians considered it unscalable. For a few crucial minutes, the Persian soldiers were alone on the wall, catching their breath, preparing for what came next. Then they were discovered. Lydian guards raised the alarm. Fighting erupted on the walls. But by then, it was too late. Enough Persians had climbed up to hold the position. More followed. The defenders rushed to contain the breach, but the Persians held, expanded their foothold, pushed deeper into the citadel. Within hours, they had fought their way to one of the gates and opened it from the inside. Persian troops poured through. Sardis fell on the 14th day, just as Cyrus had demanded. The city that morning must have been a vision of contrasts. Sardis, the wealthy, burning and bloodied. Persian soldiers, many of whom had never seen such concentrated luxury, moving through palaces filled with golden fixtures, treasury rooms stacked with precious metals, storehouses full of exotic goods from across the known world. The shock of seeing that much wealth in one place, the temptation to loot, the chaos of a city falling to assault. And somewhere in that chaos, Cyrus's men captured Croesus alive and brought him before the Persian king. What happened next became one of the most debated moments in ancient history, partly because multiple sources tell different versions, partly because it seems too philosophical, too neat to be entirely real. But the core story appears across enough accounts that something like it probably occurred. And even if it's partially legendary, it tells us something important about how these events were remembered and understood. According to the most famous version, recorded by the Greek historian Herodotus, Cyrus ordered Croesus to be burned alive. A pyre was constructed in Sardis's main square, a grim symbol of Persian victory and Lydian defeat. The former king of Lydia, the man who had been the richest person in the world just weeks before, was bound and placed on it. Soldiers lit the kindling. The flames began to grow, smoke rising into the winter sky over conquered Sardis.
And as the fire climbed toward him, Croesus cried out a name. Solon! 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 Cyrus, watching the execution, was curious enough to halt it. He sent interpreters, quickly, before the flames did their work, to ask Croesus what he meant. Who was Solon? Why was the defeated king calling out this name in his final moments? And Croesus, reprieved temporarily from death, told them a story. Years earlier, before any of this began, the Athenian sage Solon had visited his court. Croesus had been eager to impress this famous wise man. He had given Solon a tour of his treasuries, his palaces, all his magnificent wealth. Room after room of gold and silver, precious stones, exotic goods, the accumulated wealth of the richest kingdom in the world. Then, confident that Solon would be overwhelmed, Croesus had asked whether the sage had ever seen anyone more fortunate, more blessed by the gods, more enviably successful. Solon's answer had disappointed and annoyed him. The philosopher told stories of ordinary men, an Athenian who had lived a good life and died defending his city, brothers who had honored their mother and died peacefully in their sleep, simple people who had lived well and died well. These, Solon suggested, were the truly fortunate ones. Then Solon had said something that Croesus remembered now, standing on the pyre. Count no man fortunate until you know the end of his life. Until then, the best you can say is that he has been lucky. Croesus had dismissed this as the jealous words of a poor man who couldn't appreciate true wealth and power. What could Solon know about fortune? He had no gold, no kingdom, no armies. But now, years later, bound on a pyre in his own conquered capital, watching smoke rise from kindling that would soon burn him alive, Croesus understood. Solon had been right. All the gold in the world hadn't guaranteed anything. Fortune was fragile. Happiness was never secure, no matter how many talents of gold you possessed. You couldn't know if you were truly fortunate until your life was complete, until you could see the whole arc, until you knew how the story ended. And Croesus' story was ending in fire and defeat. According to Herodotus, Cyrus was moved by this tale. He recognized wisdom when he heard it, even from a defeated enemy. He saw in Croesus' story a warning about his own fortune, that success was temporary, that fate could turn, that no amount of power guaranteed a good end. He ordered Croesus removed from the pyre and kept him as an advisor, a living reminder of fortune's fragility. Whether this actually happened or whether it was a later addition to make Cyrus seem more merciful and philosophical is uncertain. Some historians think it's too neat, too story-like, too convenient a moral lesson. Others point out that there are multiple ancient sources for the tale, suggesting some basis in reality. What is certain is that Lydia ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. Its territories became part of the Persian Empire. Its treasury filled Persian coffers. Its military innovations and administrative systems were absorbed into Persian doctrine. But the real significance of the Lydian conquest goes far deeper than territorial expansion or the transfer of wealth. Cyrus had done something that changed the calculus of power in the ancient world. He had proven that wealth alone couldn't guarantee security, that traditional advantages, superior cavalry, defensive fortifications, conventional military wisdom, divine prophecy, diplomatic alliances could be overcome by creative thinking, tactical boldness, and strategic surprise. That an empire built on gold could fall to an empire built on loyalty, innovation, and the willingness to fight when and how no one expected. Think about what Cyrus had accomplished in this single campaign, each element of which defied conventional wisdom. He had violated the seasonal rhythms of ancient warfare by continuing operations in winter when everyone knew campaigns were impossible. He had neutralized a superior cavalry force using pack animals, something no military manual had ever suggested because no one had ever tried to try it. He had taken a supposedly impregnable fortress in 2 weeks through a combination of imposed urgency and meticulous observation. Each of these achievements individually would have been remarkable. Together, they announced the arrival of a new kind of military leadership, one that didn't follow rules but rewrote them. The fall of Sardis sent shockwaves across the ancient world. The Greek city-states along the Ionian coast, which had been Lydian vassals, now faced Persian overlordship, a development that would eventually lead to the famous Greco-Persian Wars and the battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. Egypt and Babylon, which had been Croesus' allies and promised support that arrived too late, now understood that the Persians were an existential threat that required immediate attention. Every kingdom from the Mediterranean to Central Asia had to recalculate its strategic position. The old power structures were obsolete. The old assumptions of warfare were no longer valid. A new era had begun, and its architect was Cyrus. But let's return to that moment on the battlefield, to the camel gambit, because it encapsulates something profound about military innovation. Cyrus was betting the entire campaign on his understanding of animal behavior. If the horses hadn't reacted as strongly as he hoped, if the Lydian cavalry had managed to overcome their mount's fear, if the wind had been blowing wrong and carried the camel scent away from the horses, if any of a dozen factors had been different, the Persian infantry would have been overrun. Cyrus himself might have been killed or captured. The entire future of the Persian Empire, which would eventually become the largest empire the world had yet seen, hung on whether horses would panic at the smell of camels. But here's what makes Cyrus's decision strategic rather than merely lucky. He wasn't just guessing. He had direct, personal experience with how horses and camels interacted. He'd probably seen this exact reaction multiple times in merchant caravans, in trading posts, anywhere these animals encountered each other. He took knowledge that others possessed but considered irrelevant to warfare, and he weaponized it. That's genius. Not pulling solutions from nowhere, but recognizing that the answer to a military problem might exist in a completely different domain of knowledge. The solution to defeating cavalry wasn't better cavalry or superior infantry tactics or advanced weapons. It was biology, animal behavior, knowledge that shepherds and merchants had, but that generals didn't think to apply. This pattern would repeat throughout Cyrus's career. He consistently found solutions in unexpected places, made connections that others missed, applied knowledge from one domain to problems in another. It's a kind of lateral thinking that seems obvious in retrospect, but is remarkably rare in practice, especially in military contexts where tradition and doctrine are deeply entrenched. The speed with which Cyrus fell is equally instructive. 14 days to take one of the most defensible cities in the ancient world seems impossible, and it would have been impossible if Cyrus had approached it conventionally. Typical sieges lasted months or even years. Attackers tried to starve defenders out, or they built massive siege works to overcome walls, or they attempted to negotiate surrender. All of these approaches take time, require patience, assume that the fortress will eventually yield to sustained pressure. Cyrus didn't have time, or rather he chose not to have time. By imposing that 14-day deadline, he forced his entire army to look at Sardis differently. They couldn't wait for starvation, they couldn't build elaborate siege equipment, they couldn't settle into comfortable routines. They had to find a way in, now, immediately, through whatever means possible. The deadline changed the entire psychological approach to the problem. It created urgency that drove innovation. Hieroeades, the soldier who discovered the route up the cliff, probably wouldn't have been looking for it if there hadn't been that sense of desperate urgency. He would have been doing standard guard duty, watching to make sure no one came out, not looking for ways to go in. The deadline made him watch more carefully, think more creatively, recognize significance in a moment that he might otherwise have ignored. It's another example of Cyrus understanding that constraints can force innovation. By giving his army less time, he gave them more motivation to think differently. After Sardis fell, Cyrus faced the question every conqueror faces: what do you do with what you've conquered? The easy answer, the historically common answer, was to loot everything valuable, enslave the population, raze the city as a warning to others. Many ancient conquerors did exactly that. Assyrian kings bragged in their inscriptions about cities they had destroyed so thoroughly that not one stone stood upon another. Roman generals paraded captured enemies through Rome before executing them. Conquest was often synonymous with destruction.
Cyrus took a different approach, one that would become characteristic of Persian imperial administration, and one reason why the Persian Empire lasted as long as it did. He left Sardis largely intact. He installed a Persian governor, established a garrison, made clear that Persia was now in control. But he allowed much of the existing administrative structure to continue functioning. He didn't force religious conversion or cultural assimilation. The temples remained open. The local gods were still worshipped. Life continued, under new management, but not fundamentally transformed. This wasn't mercy in the modern sense. Cyrus could be ruthlessly brutal when he felt it necessary, and Persian rule could be harsh for those who resisted. But it was pragmatic. A functioning, productive province generated more wealth and caused fewer problems than a destroyed, resentful one. The Greek cities that had been Lydian vassals became Persian vassals, but they retained their own governments, their own customs, their own identities. As long as they paid tribute and didn't rebel, the Persians largely left them alone. This administrative philosophy would become one of the Persian Empire's defining characteristics. Unlike many empires that tried to impose uniformity, that attempted to make conquered peoples into copies of the conquerors, the Persians generally allowed diversity. Egyptians could remain Egyptian, Babylonians could remain Babylonian, Jews could remain Jewish. It was a strategy born partly from necessity. The empire eventually became too vast to micromanage, but it started here, with Cyrus's decisions about how to treat defeated Lydia. You could argue that this approach is why the Persian Empire lasted for more than 2 centuries, surviving rebellions and invasions and internal conflicts, until Alexander the Great finally overthrew it in the 330s BCE. Empires that rule through terror and destruction create populations that wait for any opportunity to rebel. Empires that allow local autonomy, that tax but don't oppress, that conquer but don't destroy. These create systems that people can live with, even if they don't love them. The wealth of Lydia did end up in Persian hands, of course. Those famous treasuries were emptied, their contents flowing east to Persia. Croesus's gold, accumulated over decades, transported in caravans to fund Cyrus's expanding empire. But here's the interesting thing. Cyrus didn't hoard it the way Croesus had. He didn't build treasury rooms where he could walk among his riches. He used it to fund further expansion, to build infrastructure, to reward loyal soldiers and administrators, to establish the systems that would hold his empire together. The gold that had been static wealth in Sardis, sitting in underground rooms, admired but not truly productive, became dynamic capital in the Persian Empire. It flowed along trade routes, funded construction projects, paid for armies that conquered more territory, financed the administrative apparatus that governed vast distances. It's a small detail, but it illustrates the fundamental difference in how these 2 kings thought about power. Croesus accumulated, Cyrus circulated. One approach builds impressive but brittle structures. The other builds flexible, resilient ones. The lessons from this campaign rippled forward through history in ways that would have astonished both Cyrus and Croesus. When Alexander the Great studied warfare, he studied Persian tactics, including the innovations Cyrus had introduced. When Roman generals planned campaigns, they referenced Persian logistical systems, the infrastructure that allowed armies to move across vast distances. When Byzantine emperors designed their administration, they borrowed from Persian models that started with Cyrus's approach to governing conquered territories. Military academies still teach the Sardis campaign today. The United States Military Academy at West Point includes it in strategic studies courses. The British Army Staff College has used it as a case study. Military historians, from Clausewitz to modern theorists, have referenced Cyrus's innovations. The specific tactics, winter campaigning, the camel gambit, the rapid siege, are interesting historical curiosities, but the underlying principles remain relevant. The importance of logistics over equipment, the value of psychological warfare, the power of fighting at unexpected times and in unexpected ways, the danger of becoming so invested in conventional wisdom that you can't recognize when someone is rewriting the rules. Modern business schools sometimes teach the Lydian conquest as well, framed differently but illustrating similar principles. Croesus represents the incumbent with superior resources. Cyrus represents the innovative challenger who disrupts the market. The lessons translate that market leadership doesn't guarantee continued success, that innovation can overcome resource advantages, that companies need to keep adapting even when they're successful. It's the same story, different context. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the idea itself, the principle that intelligence and adaptability can overcome material advantage. It's an idea that resonates across centuries because it challenges our instinctive assumptions about power. We want to believe that having more resources means being more secure. We want to believe that if we build high enough walls and accumulate enough wealth, we'll be safe. We want to believe that success is something that can be achieved and then maintained through the same methods that brought success initially. Croesus and Croesus together tell us that this isn't how power actually works. Security doesn't come from what you have. It comes from how you think, how you adapt, how you respond to challenges you didn't anticipate. The wealthy can fall to the clever. The traditional can lose to the innovative. The powerful can be defeated by those who refuse to fight on the powerful's terms. Standing in Sardis today, and the ruins are still there, tourists can visit them, you can see the layers of history written in stone. Greek foundations, Persian modifications, Roman rebuilding, Byzantine fortifications. The city survived its fall to Cyrus by 2,500 years, though the kingdom of Lydia died that winter day in 546 BCE. The citadel walls still stand, including sections that might have been climbed by Herodias and his group on that decisive 14th night. It's tempting to imagine what Croesus thought, if he had time to think, as he watched Persian soldiers pour through gates that should have remained closed, taking a city that should have been untakeable. Did he recognize his mistake? Did he understand that his entire strategy had been built on false assumptions? Or did it simply seem like terrible luck, a sequence of improbable events that happened to go against him? We can't know his thoughts in those final hours as an independent king, but the story suggests he did eventually achieve some understanding, standing on that pyre, calling out Solon's name. Whether that happened literally, or whether it's a later addition to the story, the symbolic truth remains powerful. Wisdom often comes too late if it comes only in the moment of defeat. The time to understand fortune's fragility is before you're standing on a pyre, not after.
For Cyrus, Sardis was just the beginning. He would go on to conquer Babylon, taking one of the ancient world's greatest cities through a combination of military pressure and political subversion. He would create an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, from the Persian Gulf to the Caucasus Mountains, encompassing dozens of different peoples, cultures, languages, religions. He would establish a dynasty, the Achaemenid dynasty, that would dominate the ancient Near East for more than 2 centuries. He would become Cyrus the Great, one of history's most successful conquerors, remembered not just for his victories, but for his administrative innovations and his relatively merciful approach to defeated peoples. The campaign against Lydia was the victory that announced him to the wider world, the achievement that proved his methods worked on a grand scale, the demonstration that his approach to warfare and conquest could overcome the most powerful kingdoms of his age. Everything that came after, the conquest of Babylon, the expansion into Central Asia and India, the creation of the Persian Empire, built on the foundations laid here, in this winter campaign against the richest king in the world. But every time military historians teach this campaign, every time strategists reference it in planning sessions, every time someone tells the story of how Cyrus used camels to defeat cavalry and took an impregnable fortress in 14 days, they're reinforcing a set of principles that matter far beyond ancient warfare. That conventions exist to be questioned, that knowledge from unexpected sources can solve seemingly impossible problems, that speed and surprise can overwhelm superior resources, that creativity is a weapon more powerful than gold, that the willingness to fight when and how others think is impossible can be decisive, that rigid systems, no matter how wealthy or well defended, are vulnerable to adaptive challenges. The Battle of Sardis wasn't the largest in ancient history. It wasn't the bloodiest. It didn't directly cause the fall of other empires or the rise of new civilizations in the way some battles did, but it crystallized a moment when one kind of power, the power of accumulated wealth and conventional military strength, met another kind of power, the power of strategic innovation and adaptive thinking, and the innovative power won decisively. That's why we still tell this story 25 centuries later. That's why it still matters, still gets taught, still resonates. Because somewhere, right now, there's an equivalent to Croesus, a person, a company, a country, an institution that has accumulated tremendous resources and feels secure because of that accumulation. They're confident in their walls, their wealth, their
their conventional advantages. They've consulted their experts. They've followed all the rules. They've done everything that should guarantee success. And somewhere else, there's an equivalent to Cyrus, someone with fewer resources but more creativity, studying the problem from different angles, looking for the solution nobody else sees, preparing to do something that conventional wisdom says is impossible. Someone who understands that the rules are made to be rewritten, that battles can be fought in winter, that camels can defeat cavalry, that 14 days can be enough if you refuse to accept that it isn't. History suggests we should bet on Cyrus, not because the underdog always wins, that's not true, and plenty of Cyruses throughout history have failed, but because in a contest between static strength and dynamic adaptation, between doing things the way they've always been done and finding new approaches, between confidence in resources and confidence in creativity, the adaptive strategy has a powerful advantage that grows stronger the more committed the static power is to its conventional wisdom. When Croesus crossed the Halys River, he believed his wealth would win the war. When Cyrus crossed it, he understood that strategy would. In the end, that difference in understanding meant everything. One king ended up on a pyre, whether literal or metaphorical, watching his kingdom fall. The other ended up building one of history's great empires. The gap between those outcomes, the gap between accumulation and adaptation, between conventional power and innovative strategy, between static confidence and dynamic thinking, is what makes this story endlessly relevant, endlessly instructive, endlessly worth remembering. And if you've watched this far, you now understand something that most people miss when they hear about ancient battles. This wasn't about who had more soldiers or better equipment. This was about two completely different philosophies of power colliding, and the more adaptable philosophy winning. Which raises a question worth considering. In your own life, in your own challenges, are you Croesus or Cyrus? Are you relying on accumulated advantages and conventional wisdom, or are you looking for the unexpected angle, the solution nobody else sees, the way to fight when no one thinks it's possible? Because that difference, that fundamental difference in how you approach problems, might matter more than any resource advantage you have or don't have.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.